Yes, hello and welcome to my session, Switch It, Orchestrating a Power BI report with 5 measures. I hope all of you are going to enjoy me talking about DAX, probably one of the most easy topics to talk about. I hear myself double. All right, not anymore. Perfect. Quickly about myself. So this is me, Drescher. I come from a small town next to Berlin. And I actually have a background in bio. So I have degrees in cell and molecular biology and biotechnology. I used to work after my degrees for 3 years in a bioinformatics startup as a researcher. And during that time, I developed a big love for data. I had to teach myself a lot during that time because I really used to stand in the lab pipetting with a lab coat on. So it doesn't really have much to do with what I do today. But I realized that I enjoy working with data no matter what type of data it is. And I also had this guiding idea to make sense of the information that exists. I was very used to create new data by experiments, etc. And through my work, I felt that there's a lot of data accumulated that nobody utilizes. And I think that's how we get understanding of the world. And this has sort of been a guiding principle for me, and why I did after that, my next move is to go to Avanade in Vienna in 2021. And since then, I've been a senior data analyst now, specialization in Power BI. So I do everything like report design, security and data quality. I give workshops, and I also work on reporting architecture and governance. And what I really enjoy though, working with Power BI is actually tinkering around. If I have, maybe there's still a scientist in me, from before, but if I have an interesting project and I have to come up with solutions that I don't really find just online, or I know by heart, or that aren't really the standard, that really excites me. And there's one report that I had to make that I personally found really interesting, and I came up with a solution. I actually do not know if it's the best solution that is possible, but it turned out really well. I'm very happy about it. The client was really happy. And I would like to present it today and maybe even spark a discussion at the end if somebody has better ideas in how to implement it, because I always like to learn and grow. But I hope there's something interesting for the audience in here. Quickly to my outline. First, I'm going to show the report requirements and the look. Then what is the problem, the initial solution that I came up with, my final switch solution, and some additional information at the end. You can follow the presentation. I have like the color coding on the left side. So you approximately know where you are in the presentation. Now, to the report requirements and look. So the usual setup of a project, at least in my experience, looks similar to this. You make a report with different kinds of measures. You have different visuals, like some cards, some bar charts, some tables, and some slices and filters. However, the report that prompted me to make this presentation had a bit of a couple of limitations, or a bit of a different setup, let's say. First of all, the client only had operational knowledge. So no to little knowledge in Power BI or reporting. That's actually something that I'm quite used to. I don't know how it is about for the audience, but very often I mean, that's also why I have a job. I make reports for people that aren't capable themselves. And it's really interesting to be the bridge from data to the operational side or the functional side. Additionally, the client wanted to potentially implement changes in thresholds or in KPIs, so particular values in the future. And the client also needs to be able to continue working on the report without my help in the future. And given that the person had very little to no knowledge in Power BI, that was, of course, a certain constraint that I had to keep in mind. Now, for me, I had to implement multiple KPIs that required the same calculations. In this case, it was the median, but I come back to that later again. I also had to do regular changes because of the requirements, or there were regular changes in the requirements and the thresholds by the client. So even while I was working on it, I had to find a way to be very efficient with it and not lose oversight. So the solution I came up with even was very helpful for me too, and in the communication with the client. And I had time pressure. I had about 10 days to implement the whole thing. So usually that means you have to come up with the best functional idea you can come up with, not the most perfect, most elegant solution that might be out there. But I think this is how it's very normal in our daily business. Now, quickly towards the data set. It looked something like this. Of course, I created everything from scratch and altered things for the presentation. But you basically had a couple of projects and phases, or like a lot of date columns. There were different phases involved and certain other dates. And the idea was that the person wanted to know how many work days between those in those phases, or between a start and an end date, did a project take, and then know the overall median in the entire list of projects to understand if those are going along well, or if something is really halting, and if there's something that needs to be looked into. And then the report was supposed to look something like this. So of course, a couple of slices, etc. But mainly, as you can see here, a repetition of card visuals that contain the title of the KPI, the value, and a question mark on the top right. That was at least my idea on how to implement it. That can spawn a tooltip that contained certain descriptions that the user wanted to implement, which could change weekly, or whenever the user wanted to implement a description of the KPI maybe, or the changes that have occurred, or certain disclaimers, etc. So it needed to be something that changes frequently. And as you can also see, some conditional formatting. So whenever a certain number of projects was underneath the threshold, it was supposed to show green. If it was a median number, it was supposed to be yellow. And if very few projects were basically underneath the limit, that was supposed to be shown as red. So the client knows he's got to do something about the projects that are already over the time limit. Now, what is the problem about the whole thing? The problem is that this can lead up to 37 measures and 12 tooltips. If I have, I basically have a median calculation per KPI, because it always concerns different columns. I have a threshold calculation for the conditional formatting, and another calculation that I like to use that takes the manual effort of the conditional formatting from the visual itself and puts it into a measure itself. Plus, in this case, would also be a count rows calculation. So I'm looking at around 37 measures for these 12 KPIs. Of course, if you have more KPIs, you have more measures. So this can scale up quickly. And of course, also 12 tooltips where the user wanted to have per KPI the ability to make certain changes. Now, this is like, what would this look like? I have the example here. I hope you can see it. If you don't see a Power BI report right now, please let me know. It would basically look something like this. So you have about the 12 KPIs cards. You have the question mark. And the problem about the whole thing is, as you can see here on the right, this would lead up to a big chunk of measures. And and also 12 different tooltips. And this is a lot to handle for a person that doesn't really know how to work with Power BI. When I say doesn't really know how to work with Power BI, I mean, for example, not knowing how to implement a tooltip. And I mean, and that's fine, right? That's not the problem. That's what I'm there for. But then I cannot just create this report and hand it off to a user that then will have huge amounts of struggle in making any sorts of changes for the future. And all my work was also for nothing. That's not beneficial for anybody. So I I wanted to change it to something that looks like this. So again, you have still the same 12 KPIs. You have just one tooltip now. And in the measure table, I have 5 measures only instead of the whole list of measures that I showed earlier. And as you can see here, they're all, even though it's just one tooltip, you have different texts. It's just one measure in all of them. It's the median measure. And yeah, I want to present how I change from this to this. Just take it outside to the window. All right. First, I would like to highlight a couple of measures that are important for the presentation, just so that I don't lose anybody. The median x function that requires a row expression as an input and puts out the center value for the input expression. Network days, which is a function that allows you to calculate the weekdays between a start date and an end date. I think divide and max are pretty clear to everybody. Then you have the count rows function, which results in the number of rows in the table, and the count A function, which gives out the number of non-blank rows in a column. I will explain why that one is important later on. And then you have the all-beloved calculate function, which executes an expression in a filter context. Selected value, which returns a single value that is left in a column. And the star of the show, the switch expression, which as input takes an expression, and depending on which value this expression yields, will create a different result. And as inputs, you can have value 1, result 1, value 2, result 2, and just reiterate this pretty much, I think, as long as you want. I don't know if there's even a limit to this. And yeah, it's basically like an if function in many ways. But I prefer it in this context, and I explain also why. Now, to the starting measures that I showed in the report that had many individual measures. This is the measure that I use for the median calculation. So you have the network days function, which uses a start date and an end date, calculates number of weekdays in between, and that's packaged into a median x function. So you calculate the median x for all of the rows, the values of the rows of this network days function. Then you have the percentage of the projects underneath the threshold. In this case, at the start, I have given the threshold as a variable. It's just a bit easier to put it at the start because then I can just copy and paste this layout for all the different threshold measures and just implement the different values here, and I don't have to search for it in the measure itself. And then that's been followed up by a divide function that divides a calculate of count rows, which are filtered in the following way. For all the projects where the number of weekdays is underneath the threshold or is equal to, they're supposed to be filtered through. All of the other projects that are over the time limit, over the threshold limit, they're supposed to be ignored. And this is divided by the total number of rows in the table. And then that gives a percentage. For example, 0 to 30% would be a red KPI, a red formatting, 30 to 70% yellow, and 70 to 1% green. If the value turns out blank, that would be black. That can, for example, occur if no projects have yet reached the end of a certain phase. So this table wasn't always just completely filled. It was actually growing at the time. So I would look at projects that were at the last phase. I was looking at projects that were at the start, and all of this had to be accounted for. So it was a growing, ebbing and flowing data table. So if there is no median value, then it was supposed to show black. And then I have a conditional formatting measure that I put on top of the threshold. That's something that's my personal preference. I like to work as minimal as possible in the visuals themselves and rather control things via measures. In this case, I use the threshold measure that I just showed before. And if that measure puts out a blank, then it's supposed to give the value 4. If it's under 30%, then 3, 70%, 2, and rest 1. And that's how I then implement this in each visual. I like it a bit more because I can control in the measure themselves the percentages, which is something I prefer over visuals, which can easily also be deleted. And measures I find just a bit more sustainable, and I prefer them as the operational tools that I use in my reports. And then, of course, the count rows and a couple slicers and other measures. At least that's what I had in the initial report. And as I mentioned earlier, this leads up to 37 measures and more. Now, what was my initial solution? I wanted to use the switch function. It was a very early idea. I don't know if anybody in the audience has ever worked with it. It's basically a good way to avoid multiple nested if statements. It has a very nice and clean formatting structure. You can use values or expressions as inputs, as you can see on the right, and it can output values or measures. So it can also be used, for example, as a slicer, where you can switch in a visual between different groups or measures. So it's quite versatile in how you can use it. And on top of that, I needed a couple of requirements for my initial solution, which was, first of all, a data table. That's a very central part of the whole setup, because it was supposed to be the focal point in which the user can implement any changes. So it would include the names of the KPIs, the threshold values, and the descriptions that the person wants to add into the tooltips. So my idea was really to have not so many different measures where the user has to make a lot of changes, and then really make sure that he does them for all of the measures and doesn't forget any of them, but rather just have one, let's say, one point where he can make all of those changes, and it's a bit more easy to overview and control. The next thing would be the switch function or switch measure, which takes as an input the expression, and then depending on the value yields out a certain result. All of this has to be defined, of course. And then I use filters that use KPI names or also the IDs, as I'm going to show, because I think it's actually a bit better, of the data table to filter the switch functions. So first I want to show the data table. I don't know if anybody in the audience has ever worked with it. I really like it. It's a good way to create data or like a functional table in the Power BI report using DAX. You don't have to load this, and it's quite easy to implement. In this case, I use first the IDs, which are integers. Then I have the KPIs, which are strings, and show the names of the KPIs. In this case, I wanted to keep it quite simple, just phases 1 to 12. The threshold values, again, integers, and then the descriptions, which can even be, you can even use an enter to create a new row. You're not just confined by block text, which is something I really like. Exactly, and that's the data table. And that's what the switch function then uses to do its job in the report itself. Now, in the initial solution that I had, I just wanted to create a few measures that I can use in the visuals themselves. I had already created all the median functions, etc., and I decided to make a referred switch setup, in which case I use as an expression that the switch function takes as an input, which in this case is the ID in the data table. So depending on which ID is being chosen, it executes the according measure. So for example, if I pick ID 1, which I control via the filters of the visual, in this case, as you can see, ID is 1, it would execute the median 0, 1 function or measure, which I also highlighted earlier, which looks like this. And in the formatting function, I can do exactly the same thing. I have the same exact buildup. So it takes the ID in the data table as an input, depending on the ID, which I control over the filters. It then executes the formatting function. In this case, I already have the threshold function set up, and I can just refer to it via this measure. And depending if the median value is, or the percentage is under 30%, 70%, 1, or even blank, it controls the formatting, the conditional formatting of the visual. And I can use those two measures as inputs for all of the visuals. Now, so I use only a few measures in the visuals themselves. And I use the filters for specification of the KPIs. But what did I just do with this? I created 4 more measures. And I'm still using the original 37. And that's doesn't necessarily make it easier to handle for the user, because certain essential changes in the measures still need to be done in the individual ones. If he wants to change, for example, the columns that are being used, etc., then this has to be done in the individual measures. So the switch in this case is only a bridge, but it doesn't solve the actual problem that I was facing. And so things just got more complicated for the user. And this is when I decided for the final switch solution that I came up with, which is to implement all of the measures into the switch measure. So instead of having 12 measures that I refer to, I include the entire code for each measure in the switch measure. Now this creates, of course, a certain block of text. However, it's a very, very repetitive deal here. So we use, again, the selected value of the IDs, and depending on which IDs are being chosen, it executes the according median x function. And the median x function looks at the table and executes or calculates the median of all of the network days between those two columns. Depending on which ID is chosen, it switches that up to the remaining median x function, which is left. Now you can also sort of implement this as a variable in an if statement, where, for example, if the calculation leads to a blank, I don't just want to have it as blank, or I don't remember the German term, but depending on the language, the word that is being shown, it can group it around with the formatting that you maybe want to have in the card visuals. So it's very uncontrollable depending on what the language is that the user has in Power BI. And instead, I opted to implement these 2 lines as a sign that there's no value shown here. And if the calculation is not blank, then it would just show the median value that is yielded. The nice thing about this is also, I don't have to implement this in every single measure of all of those 12. I only have to do this once. So there's already a bit of effort that I save for myself, and also for future potential additions of other measures, etc. Then the next thing would be the threshold measure. In this case, I first have a divide statement. So I divide a switch measure by the total number of rows in the table. The switch measure in this case is what I also showed a bit earlier. It takes the ID as an expression. If it's a 1, for example, it would calculate the number of rows in the final date of this phase, filtered by how many of these projects are still within the threshold. Okay, that's all in a calculate function. And maybe you've noticed that in the end I use a max function for the threshold value. I could use a lot of different measures here. At the end of the day, since we're already using the filter on the visual, and the filter filters the switch function, there's only going to be one threshold left, the threshold of the ID that's being chosen. And so if I use a max, min, average, doesn't really matter. It's always going to put out or utilize the threshold that's in this row. So all of the rows in this column that fulfill this filter expression or go through it, they will be kept and they will be divided by the count rows. And this block from the 1 to the bracket, the closed bracket, you just have to repeat this for every KPI that's there. So it looks like a lot of text. I mean, I'm at line 69, which maybe for some people is not a lot, for others maybe a lot, for one single measure, but it's just 12 times the same block of text. So it's nothing, nothing too challenging, let's say, at least in my opinion. Now I had to make a change to this as well. As I call this now threshold 2.0. I don't just divide by the total number of rows in the table, but I have to divide by the total number of rows in the column that I'm already filtering for. So as I mentioned earlier, in this project, the table was moving. It was growing or decreasing, and projects were coming to fulfillment while I was working on them. So it can be that I'm looking at a table where 80% of the projects aren't in, let's say, phase 12. Now I don't want to know the number of projects that are underneath the threshold in phase 12 of all of the projects, most of which aren't even there yet. So it would be a low percentage that doesn't actually tell you how many projects are of the ones in phase 12 are over or under the threshold. So I have to use the count A function, which calculates the number of non-blank rows in a particular column. So if only, let's say, 20 projects have reached the end of a certain phase, only those will be used to be divided by. So I basically divide two switch statements by each other. Interestingly, you could also switch this up. You could make a switch statement in which you, depending on which ID is being chosen, you divide the calculate by the count A. So you can actually swap this. You can either do a divide of two switches, or you can do a switch of 12 divides. It would be up to the user and how they want to implement the switch setup. What's the most, let's say, overviewable? And of course, this you can also then package into a variable and give out as a return the formatting calculation that I had before. And the nice thing about this is, again, I only need to do this once. I don't have to do this 12 different times for all of the different measures. In this case, I only have one measure, the divide of two switches, and depending on the percentage that's being output by this measure, I will then I can then say, okay, it's supposed to be black, red, yellow, or green in the actual visual. Now with this, I solved that I have just one measure for the median and one threshold and formatting measure. So I compressed all of these 37 measures into 2 to replace everything else. And I use the filters to control which measures are being used. And I use the data table as a controlling point for threshold. Now, what's being unresolved is, I said 5 measures, right? That's the title of my presentation. And the third measure is a question mark. Yes, you can actually do this. I personally really like it. You can have a measure that's just a question mark as a string, and you can implement this into a card visual. And you can then, instead of a just text box, you can actually put tooltips on it, which is a nice design feature that I like to implement. You cannot do this in a description box, at least not last time I tried. The next function this would be for the title, which uses selected value of the KPI name in this case. That you also find in the data table again. And the last measure I use is for the tooltip. So I actually select the value of the description that you also find in the data table. And with that, I have 5 measures. All of them pretty much use just the data table as a controlling point or refer to the data table itself. So that also means that whenever you want to make any changes, you just need to do it in the data table. Now, how would this look like in the report itself? Let me just pull it up. Hope again that you see the report. So as I highlighted before, this is the number of measures on the right side that I need to use for this. I always have the same kind of card visual setup. So on each KPI visual, I have the filter, which is in this case ID1. I use the median as a calculation. I have in the conditional formatting, I use the threshold formatting measure that you see here on the right. And I have 4, 3, 2, 1 as values, which then lead to different colors. And I have the same setup for all of the 12 visuals. So I just need to copy and paste really and just change the filter and does this accordingly. The same goes for the title. Now you might be asking, why would I implement a title as a card visual that I then also have to filter? Yeah, well, one little drawback of this is that if I implement just one measure in each visual, I also just have this text of this one measure. But if I would turn on the data label, it just would show this. So that would mean manual effort in changing the title in each visual. That's something I personally don't really like. I think it's not very handy, especially for somebody that doesn't have a lot of experience with Power BI. So I decided to use title instead. I used the selected value of the KPI names in the data table, and I control this via the ID. Now the last piece of each card is the question mark, also a visual, also filtered by 1, so you can apply the same filters for all of the 3 visuals. And this one has the has tooltip activated, in this case, what I call the tooltip. So it just uses whatever is being output here. Now, of course, now you see a blank. That is because currently on this page, I don't have any filters applied. So the switch function, since I didn't give it an else or like final else output, it's only going to show blank. But by using the filters, it actually is going to show the text that I gave it. And this is always the same measures just because I changed the filters on this. As you can see here, I have ID2. Here I have ID3. It's going to show a different text that can be altered quite quickly. And this is all being controlled by this data table here, all the thresholds, the names, and the descriptions themselves. So the user just needs to work in here and not in the visuals themselves. Now, of course, I would like to. So this is the setup that I implemented. Now to the additional information. What if the user wants to change KPI information? What if the user wants to change, for example, the threshold? Well, he just needs to do this inside the data table. I can show you this live too. Let's imagine here in the data table, I changed this 85 to, let's say, just a 50. Press enter, and the visual is going to turn to red immediately because only a small fraction of projects is actually underneath the threshold that I just set. Most of them are over, so it's going to show red. So this can be done pretty quickly. Now, what if I want to change, for example, the tooltip description? I don't have to go now into every tooltip and change it in the text box. I only need to change it in here. And for example, for the last, that now shows LLL. If I say A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and I press enter, Of course, that's exactly the descriptions that the user would also use, of course. It now shows A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And I didn't have to go into the visual. I didn't have to change any tooltips. Everything is being controlled by the data table itself. Now, and if I want to, for example, change the KPI name, it's the same thing. Here, instead of phase 12, I could, for example, name it phase XXXXX. Press enter, and it's going to be reflected in the title KPI, in the title card. And now another question is, for example, what if I want to create a new measure, right? This is a setup that's very, very well aimed towards having, in this case, 12 KPIs. But what if I want to add a new measure to it? A new KPI, a different median of other columns. You just need to copy paste this line that you see right here highlighted. You just copy it, comma behind, you paste it. You change the ID to, let's say, a 13. You can add or change the name of the KPI, the threshold that it has, and the description that it's supposed to have. Then you do the same change in the two switch measures. You just copy and paste each individual line or box. Just change the ID and the columns that you want to use. And so also for somebody that doesn't, that's not really used to working with Power BI or coding as a whole, just copy pasting one line is more simple than having to write everything in a new measure where you don't really see what the other lines are looking like. I know because I used to work in a very different kind of field. I had to learn everything myself, and it's not very intuitive. You got to get there. It's through work and through time. And in the end, of course, you got to create a new visual. So you just copy paste the group of 3 visuals that I had, and you just change the filter of all of the 3 to the new ID. And then you can implement this somewhere in the report, and that's about it. I mean, of course, now this solution is a very specific one. It only, I mean, at least in my case, the Power BI user had very low Power BI skills. There were multiple columns that, at least in my perspective, and given the time, made unpivoting not possible. So I had to work with a lot of different measures, and I couldn't group it into, I couldn't just, work with it differently. The measures were very repetitive, which, of course, in the switch function, you could implement all kinds of measures. It doesn't have to be bound to the same. As long as a couple of setups are the same, like, let's say, the formatting or certain, the if functions that I put at the end, if those are quite similar, then you can add other measures to it as well. And of course, a big important piece of the whole thing was that I was working with a lot of individual measures. So I couldn't use bar charts, etc. And this is something I find really fascinating about working with not only with Power BI, but in general in the field, is that it's not only in how you can, let's say, present the data best, but also how you make it work with the person that has to utilize it later. And it's an interesting contrast, and it makes projects really interesting to me, at least. And yeah, that's actually already it. I see I'm actually really good in time, which I guess for a lot of people are going to be very happy because they can go into lunch. But thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, if you have any comments regarding my solution, I'm very happy to hear them. As I said earlier, it might not be the best. I'm not sure. It's the one I came up with. I haven't found others really online. So yeah, I'd be happy for a little discussion. So don't be shy and ask questions. Thank you.